Okay, so my name's Sally Engle Mary, and I am actually the Silver Professor of Anthropology at New York University and a faculty co-director of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU Law School. And I have done a lot of research on human rights and legal anthropology, looking at how local people use the legal system and then how human rights are mobilized by local people, and more recently looking at quantification as a form of knowledge production. And I'm delighted to be here at the Bergen Exchanges, which is a very interesting program. I think the Bergen Exchanges is a very exciting place, which is focusing on sort of law and social transformation, a core problem that we all need to be thinking about but are not doing it enough. My current research is really looking at the implications of trying to quantify the world. The concern I began with was that we privilege quantitative knowledge so heavily over qualitative knowledge or ethnographic knowledge. And I have begun to say this is a valuable form of knowledge and technology, but it has limitations that we are not necessarily sufficiently aware of. Mm-hmm. So I'm now looking at the limitation produced by what I call infrastructure, which is how exactly does counting happen? Where do the resources come to count, and who pays, and what gets counted, and what doesn't get counted, and who doesn't get counted, depending on access to expertise and knowledge and resources. I did research on how the UN Statistical Commission, which is a UN body that manages statistics, tried to figure out how to go about counting the incidents of violence against women around the world. Now, this is not an easy thing to count, actually, because there are many different things that go into defining what violence against women is, and how do you come up with a way of measuring something that's so variable across cultures and classes and regions. And, of course, the way they did it was to simplify and decontextualize and make everything the same. And it's that process of how you produce knowledge based on counting that I'm particularly interested in. And on the one hand, it's important to reform, but on the other hand, it can be very misleading. You miss a lot of things, so that in this case of violence against women, it doesn't look at structural factors, doesn't look at state violence, it doesn't look at trafficking or all kinds of other problems, but instead simply looks at the act of violence between a perpetrator and a victim. And now we know that 19%, or at least some data says, 19% of all the women in the world have experienced violence. This was a statistic that I heard at the latest meeting of the Statistical Commission. But what do we know? What does 19% mean? We need to know who and how and why and under what circumstances. And so it both provides us useful knowledge, but also very limited knowledge. What's interesting is that gradually, historically, we've developed ways of measuring things so that temperature was created and height and weight. You know, there's a sort of a culturally creative process that takes place over time. But now we're trying to measure things that are very interesting, difficult conceptual things like the rule of law or human rights compliance or violence against women or trafficking, and these are very complicated concepts, and so to actually find ways to count them is difficult conceptually. And there's a tendency to pick up models that have been used to study this in the global north and apply these to the global south, which is one of the concerns I have, that the people who are actually being measured don't necessarily have sufficient input into what they think is important and how they think it should be measured. And this means you may get misleading data or mispopulations that you really want to include. They are actually quite different. And I'm not trained as a lawyer, I'm trained as an anthropologist, and my idea was always that I wanted to look at law from the outside, which is the way most people view law. So I've been sort of studying how litigants feel about the law, how users, how it gets mobilized. And in the field of human rights, I've looked at how everyday communities, activists, NGOs mobilize human rights ideas. In the course of this, of course, I've looked at how the law functions itself, the internal dimensions of law. And I have taught a number of law students, and it's clear to me that they're very different kind of conceptualizations of how you produce knowledge and what knowledge is between the legal field and anthropological field. And where anthropology likes to kind of destabilize existing categories like gender and rights, my impression is that lawyers want to clarify categories and define things and be sure that you know what you're talking about, which is also legitimate. I mean, that's what you have to do if you're going to practice law. So there's a deep tension between these two fields, which is quite interesting.